Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of ancient Greece, right? So we just left off in my E period just now, and I've now officially had all of you at least once, right? Really big fans of the class of 2026, right? Yeah, 2026, that's what y'all are. Like, huge fans, actually. Like, oh my god, B period, C period, E period had so much fun. I'm getting to learn a lot of y'all's names. A bunch of y'all are starting to realize that the more you participate in class with, like, questions and answers and stuff, it makes it a lot more bearable. There's a lot of content. I talk about a lot of stuff. I get really into things, right? But I do get excited, and I hope that y'all get excited with me, right? But the big thing about it, speaking of, something that I also get excited about, is talking about the 8 Greek time periods. Who would ever get excited about that, right? So the big thing about it, though, is getting into it. I get excited about it because time periods are super important. I think it was Katie today in E period that was like, oh, we need time periods and stuff like that, so we know exactly what we're talking about. I'm like, exactly right, Katie, so good. Like, you have to know these time periods so you can know what part of the story that we're in. These are like chapters in a book, if you will, right? So getting into it real quick, I talked to all y'all a little bit in class about this kid I know named Dylan that I used to teach, who came up with this really goofy way to remember all the 8 Greek time periods in order, right? And he would always say, Nathan eats bacon. Meanwhile, mommy dances at Charlie's house. Nathan eats bacon. Meanwhile, mommy dances at Charlie's house. And that was a mnemonic device so he could always remember the very first letter of each of those time periods, which again sounds like a sad little boy is at home eating bacon while his mom is out dancing somewhere, which is a little terrifying. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is it's a great little way to remember all this stuff. But the actual names of them are Neolithic, Early Bronze, Minoan, Mycenaean, Dark Ages, Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. And you already probably know a lot of stuff about these, and you just don't even realize it. So many things were being said in C period yesterday when it's like, oh, one kid almost knew like the answer, like she said Pantheon, but she was pretty close to saying Parthenon. We were talking about that building. You knew what columns were. Like C period kids were talking about like different gods and goddesses and all this other stuff like that as well. And B period was doing it too. So it was really impressive what y'all were doing and what you were getting after. And most of the things you already know about ancient Greece come from these 4 time periods right there, okay? Now, we'll talk about some other stuff, and a story you might actually hear in Miss Savoy's class, because she's fantastic. Let her know I said that. You can even tell her, be like, look, he said it in his flip, how awesome you were, Miss Savoy. And so, like, you can just pull this up on her board and show it to her, right? But the Minoan one, you'll actually learn a little bit about in her class, if you talk about Theseus and the Minotaur and some of these myths and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and get into it, right? Let's start cracking our way through all these things, okay? Well, we have to talk about one thing, actually, a little bit before that. We have to talk about Greek geography a little bit. But if you need to pause it and write these down real quick and just kind of slowly start getting used to them, we're going to drill them a lot, though, all right? So before we can even talk about ancient Greece, though, we have to talk a lot about ancient Greek geography. We have to talk about Greece's geography, what it looks like, how large it is, where is it coming from, what's more important to them, trade or agriculture and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and get into it. Let's start off by looking at a map, right? So this is a map of Greece, but it's a special kind of map. Some of you are like, that ain't no map of Greece, that's a hurricane. No, it's not. So like, I know it looks a lot like a weather map, right? It looks very similar to a weather map. Kind of like the little spirals or whatever you see when they're talking about hurricanes. Knock on wood for none of those this year, right? Like, so no thank you. Now, anyway, the big thing about it, though, is that is actually a topographical map of Greece, right? So the more red or orange you see means that it's a higher elevated area, okay? So it means it's actually measuring elevation while it's also measuring the borders that go around the country itself. 2 distinct things you're going to notice immediately about ancient Greece, or Greece in general, is you're going to notice that 1, it's extremely mountainous, and 2, that there's tons of islands off the coast as well. And it's also surrounded by salt water and 2 very large seas. So the thing about it that we'll start off with is let's start talking about the mountainous geography of Greece, right? So the thing about it that with Greece is that you have to understand is that it is a very mountainous place, very mountainous country, and that's going to really affect the settlements that start popping up there. Because something that you have to remember always is that in history, and especially the ancient history that we're talking about right now, is that all big cities, Athens, Sparta, the Minoans, Mycenae, Troy even, we'll talk about, well, they were in Turkey, but still, when you're talking about all these things, they started out as small settlements, right? Little villages that turned into really big cities over time. The thing about it, though, with Greece, this is really interesting, is these villages and cities actually popped up slowly, kind of independent from one another. They popped up really slowly on their own, and the geographic isolation, especially after the Dark Ages, actually led to these individual little city-states not being able to talk to each other very much. because the mountains got in the way, okay? So basically, when you think about it, the two big ones to always understand are Athens and Sparta, who don't even get founded until way later, right? We're not talking the Dark Ages. The 5th time period is when when the Athenians and the Spartans really get founded, right? But you're talking about these two different cities that were intrinsically very different from each other when it came to their culture. Athens was all about government and art and philosophy, and Sparta was all about war and going to war and conquer and turning their conquered people into slaves, right? So very different cultures, because mountainous terrain in the mountains separated for them from one another. So as they were developing, their cultures developed very, very independent. But it also means that there were bunches of city-states all over Greece that may or may not have gotten along, might have been allies, might have hated each other and stuff like that. Another thing that you need to understand about ancient Greece is that actually their farmland is garbage. Now, the thing most people also think about when they talk about ancient societies, they always start talking about little things like, how was their farming? What did they farm? La 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 la. So when you're talking about the ancient Greeks, though, you have to understand that they didn't really have that much farmland to work with in the first place. Only 20% of Greece is truly farmable due to soil deprivation, nutrients that are missing from the soil. Also, there's another one as well where it has to do with it's very, very hard to plant on the side of a mountain. But only about 20% of the farmland itself is actually even really, really usable. And it only grows a handful of things that we'll talk about here in a second. It's also bordered by two large bodies of water, right? Two large seas or bodies of water that actually sit on the outskirts of the entire country, right? And it's the Ionian, whoops, there goes my phone. It's the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea. The Aegean Sea is right here, which, by the way, I think you should highlight Aegean Sea for me really quick, because it's actually really, really important that you'll hear a myth about how it got its name and stuff like that a little bit later on. We'll actually talk about it tomorrow in class. One of my favorite myths to tell has to do with Theseus and this woman named Ariadne that he fell in love with and a magical ball of string. Now, going into it, though, you have to understand. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah, the Aegean. We'll talk about how it got its name and stuff like that. But the Aegean is right here on the eastern side. The Ionian is on this side, on the western side. Now, the Ionian and the Aegean seas are actually two seas that are inside of the Mediterranean, right? The Mediterranean is the bigger body of water, and the Aegean and the Ionian kind of go together to create the Mediterranean. And it expands with a couple other ones, like the Strait of Gibraltar and the Gallipoli and the Dardanelles and all this other stuff. Now, getting into it, though, in general, so we've got, let's do a quick reassessment. We've got a super mountainous country that's dividing all these early city-states. We got garbage farmland, and we got oceans everywhere and a bunch of these different islands, okay? Now, these islands are going to make trade very, very important for them. Now, there's a reason why trade became very important, because even with this garbage farmland, there was only a couple of things that even grew in Greece, right? The things that would even grow in Greece, the only things that grew well anyway, are grains, grapes, and olives. Now, the thing about it, though, is the grains weren't even there to start. The only reason that Greeks had access to grains that we sometimes refer to as cereals, the only reason that they were able to get things like barley and wheat and anything like that that you can use to make the big staple crop that all ancient societies survived off of, bread, you have to understand really, really quick, as we go through this entire course, you're going to realize that empires have lived and died by the availability of bread, right? And I love bread, personally. For anybody that's gluten intolerant or has celiacs in the house, I hate it for you, because there's nothing better than fresh baked bread. You ever been to Texas Roadhouse? Oh my God, the bread rolls that they serve, I'd fight somebody for one of those right now. The big thing about it, though, is the only reason they got those grains in the first place is because they traded with these people known as the Mesopotamians, right? I know we talked about that in E period a little bit, yeah? So the thing about it is they traded with them these two products that they could actually grow that only the Greeks knew how to grow, and they would make stuff out of them. The grapes and the olives were the things the Greeks traded all the time, because you can't really live off grapes and olives, but grapes and olives made two things that the Greeks learned how to develop that made them a lot of trade value and made them really important. The grapes could be fermented into wine, and the olives could be pressed into an oil that was used as both a preservative and is also something you could cook with, right? So going into it as well, so they traded with the Mesopotamians for those grains, and it turns out the grains grew pretty well in Greece. That right there, though, is an olive tree in Greece. This is actually off the off the coast of mainland Greece, and an island that starts with a V. I think it's Voinias or something like that. But it's literally that olive tree. I always put this on there because it's just crazy how good olives grow in Greece. Because legit, that olive tree is 2,000 years old and it still makes olives. That tree right there sprouted and was born while Christ was still alive. That's bananas when you think about it, right? That's how well olives grow in Greece, right? And also Greek olive oil is very, very good. So is Italian olive oil. Now look, going into it though in general, now we're moving into our time periods, right? Now you might be able to do yourself a little bit of favors or something like that if you want to like start like kind of labeling the sections in your notes by the time periods, being like, all right, Neolithic Greece, all right, early Bronze Age, or blah, 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 and then just put a couple of bullet points underneath it. Just to give you a heads up though, we did have our Nathan eats bacon, meanwhile mommy dances at Charlie's house, right? We got those four on either side. The first two that we're about to talk about are the Neolithic period and the early Bronze period. And I'm not kidding. This is how much you have to write down. That's it. All right. So for the Neolithic period, that is all, because they're really, really simple time periods. They're not like crazy or over the top or anything like that. All the Neolithic Greek one is when those settlements began to start. When they started becoming, well, that word that we talked about in class today, sedentary, right? Not nomadic anymore. When they started becoming sedentary and they started staying in one place and making farming settlements and then actually growing these olives and grapes and then learning that they could put them in pots and stuff like that and then trade them off. Actually, Greeks have tons and tons and tons of ancient pottery and stuff like that we've actually had access to, because you got to store wine and olive oil inside of a canister so you can trade it. So the thing about it though is that when we're looking at it, the Neolithic Greeks, all it really is just early evidence of farming, pottery, early signs of religion, burial sites, some like very, very small figurines that they would sometimes carve out of stone, which tells us they might have started believing in certain gods and goddesses and stuff like that. The thing you need to understand though is that's really all it is the Neolithic period is just, they started making villages and stuff. Then those villages began to grow into cities, and those cities began to grow into civilizations right around this time period when we're getting into the early Bronze period, okay? Now most of like Greek history, well not most of Greek history, half of Greek history is taken up by a Bronze Age. The other half is taken up by an Iron Age, right? Well, the thing about it is, let's start off with the Bronze one, right? The early Bronze Age, it started about 3200 BC, and ranged all the way to about 2000 BC, is defined by the introduction of a certain metal. And that particular metal is bronze. So what ends up happening in the early Bronze period is the early Greeks begin to start mining this stuff out of the ground. And they realize when they're looking at some of these rocks that there are these really, really hard sedimentary deposits in it, right? Very, very hard things that if they heat this rock up enough will melt out of it, and then they could form it into a shape and then cut an edge into it, which means it's forgeable. Like metals have several different properties. Like you got forgeable metals, ductile metals, malleable metals, right? But a forgeable metal is really important because it means that it can be grouped together and then hardened into something that you can use as either a weapon or, in some cases, an art form as well. Bronze, though, was very, very important as well because it was really easy to access for the Greeks, and it isn't that deep into the soul. So going into it, though, as well, some of you are probably like, but wait a minute, Mr. Terry, pump your brakes. What is bronze? All right, well, that's the interesting little thing about it. You do need to know this. You might need to write this down. Bronze is what's known as an alloy. An alloy is a mixture of metals, okay? So bronze itself is not on the the periodic table of elements, right? It's not an element itself. Like if I dig into the dirt, I don't just find bronze. I have to make bronze by mixing two metals together. And those two metals are copper and tin. And that's why whenever we find evidence of things like this, like archaic Greek sword and stuff like that, that is made out of bronze. Well, not archaic. They were using iron in the archaic period. This would be like a Mycenaean or a Minoan sword if it's made out of bronze. So the biggest thing about it, though, in general, is when we found this bronze sword, you'll notice that it's turning colors, right? It's turning green. And the reason why it's turning green is when the copper inside of the bronze begins to oxidize, it turns green in like a form of rust, right? That's why the Statue of Liberty is green, because she is made of copper, right? She is made of copper, and then over time, that copper will oxidize and turn green. And also, we can't really stop the oxidization of the Statue of Liberty. She's just too big, you know what I mean? Like, she's just way too large. There's no way you're going to make her back to her original, like, copper color. It's just never going to happen, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, you have to understand that the Bronze period is very important because we're now not making stone tools anymore, like we talked about in class today. We're now actually making bronze tools, metal forgeable bronze tools that are going to be really, really big when it comes to farming, and also really big when it comes to war. Now, going into it, though, as well, now we really got to start getting serious. We are now moving into our first group of people that we get to talk about in ancient Greece. We're now talking about our first civilization in ancient Greece, if you will. We were talking about our first thing of people, our first large-scale group that we literally only just found out about a little bit ago. Like we've only even known these people existed for about, like, 123 years. Well, no, take that back. About 150 years. About 150 years is the only amount of time we even knew these people existed, because then they're called the Minoans, right? The Minoans are the very first people to set up shop in what is known as ancient Greece. Now, if I'm talking about the Minoans, this is where it's weird. All Minoans were types of Greeks, but not all Greeks were Minoans. If that you ever knew like the whole like circle or the square and a rectangle rule, like for example, all Athenians are Greek, but not all Greeks are Athenian, right? So because that was a very certain settlement. So we're talking about right now the very first settlement in ancient Greece, and they were known as the Minoans. Now, a really important thing to ask yourself right now is on a scale of 1 to 10 about like how much do we really know? How much do we really know about the Minoans? If we only found out about them like 150 years ago, how much do we truly know about these people? Well, the thing about it is not a lot. They do have a writing system, but we can't translate it. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So like they have a writing system, but we can't change it. We can't read it. We don't know what it says. So we don't really know a ton. But we found out recently in about 1900, literally the year 1900, 1900, we started finding out a lot of stuff about them, mainly just because the site itself started being uncovered, right? So we've only known about them since the early 1900s. In the year 1900, a British archaeologist by the name of Sir Arthur Evans, right? Sir Arthur Evans. Sir Arthur Evans? Sir Arthur Evans is the man credited with discovering a lot of stuff about the Minoans. Now, it's very, very important to throw this out there just so we can understand, too, that this is a Greek cultural site, and this is a Greek place, and this guy is English, right? So it's just kind of important to make sure that we're giving Greek people their due. It actually was discovered before that. Sir Arthur Evans actually came upon the discovery after someone else had... And the Greek guy that actually discovered this entire settlement that Sir Arthur Evans is going to popularize and do way more research on and actually kind of like figure all this stuff out was a guy actually by the name of Minos Kalakaironos, okay? Like, so literally, he was the one that discovered in 1878, but this guy named Sir Arthur Evans got called down to this very, very special place, and he was a British archaeologist, and they were like, look, there's this site on this island that we need you to go check out. Now, where is this island, right? It's one of the islands off the coast of Greece, and it's going to be the oldest archaeological site that has ever been found up to this point in 1900, and it's on the island known as Crete. You need to make sure you write that down. Crete. The island of Crete is where the focal point of the Minoan civilization was, okay? So the Minoans popped up on this little island, and they had this large-scale palace that was originally discovered by that guy, Minos, but Sir Arthur Evans is going to bring a team of archaeologists down there, and he's going to begin to dig and uncover this expansive site that would later on be known as the Palace of Knossos, right? And he then realized in his discussion, in his production of different artifacts, in his finding of these different things, he was like, wait a minute, y'all. These are not the Mycenaeans, which are actually the period after this one, right? It goes, Nathan eats bacon, meanwhile mommy. So like meanwhile mommy is Minoans, and then the next one's Mycenaeans. For a long time, people thought that the Mycenaeans were the oldest type of Greek. He comes up and he says, no, the Palace of Knossos, this archaeological site that sits on the island of Crete, which is right off the coast of of Greece, actually shows us that these people were intrinsically different from them. They had different art, they had different structures, they had different language, they had different everything. So Sir Arthur Evans begins to do the archaeological work and realizes that there are a whole new people all their own. Now, the thing about it, though, is, like I said, he figured this out, but we don't know a ton about them, right? We don't know a lot about them, but we do know that they are the foundations of what we call culturally Greek, because they're going to do certain things and start certain trends that are going to literally become known as just like a Greek thing, right? So, like, it's going to become an intrinsically known Greek thing, and that right there is the site. Okay, so really, really quickly, this is what we think Knossos, like, this is what Knossos looks like now. You can go to Crete and actually go and see this site. It's not a lot to look at. I've actually, like, seen it before. It's just kind of like, because most of this stuff was actually reconstructed by Arthur Evans and his team. They like built up some of this stuff to try and show people what it might have looked like a little bit while I was there. But if you were actually to be there thousands of years ago, in about 2000 BC, 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, this is what the Palace of Knossos we think would have actually looked like. A very large-scale complex where the leader of the Minoans would have actually ruled over his little empire from, right? Now, speaking of that ruler, the Minoans and all that other stuff, it's like, how did they get this name? Like, where did all this stuff come from? What do we really know about them? Well, we do know that Knossos is not their only settlement, right? Knossos is right here on the island of Crete, and that there are several other little settlements that we found there as well over time. After Sir Arthur Evans uncovered all the stuff in Knossos, he then branched out and discovered some artifacts in Malia, Zakros, Phaistos, and several other areas on the island as well. But where does the name itself come from? Where does the name itself? Why did he name them the Minoans? He named them after a Greek mythological figure. There's an old story that has to do with this hero named Theseus, and it's known as the national myth of Athens, right? That's what we'll talk about it a little bit later, but in that story, there's a villain, and the villain is known as King Minos, right? King Minos was this guy who ruled from an island and took over all these different areas of ancient Greece. He ruled with an iron fist, he was embarrassed by one of his sons, and he had a beautiful daughter. But the thing about it is that we also apparently know is that apparently the guy lived in this big palace, right? And a lot of people, like for example, Sir Arthur Evans, thought maybe there's a chance that this is the place that Athens was talking about, right? Maybe this is the place, right? Did he live in the Palace of Knossos? Did he found the Minoan civilization? So he named them after King Minos, the villain in that entire thing, being like, oh, he probably ruled from this place. And the reason why he came up with that is because the principal site of the Minoan kingdom, first of all, we don't even know what it is, right? Like this Palace of Knossos could have been a marketplace, could have been a tax collection center, it could have been a lot of different stuff, but it's built in a very, very intrinsically intense way. It's built in the style of what's known as a labyrinth, right? It's built in a labyrinth style, which means it's actually built kind of like a maze, right? Like, so like now, as you can see, there's all these walls all over the places and passageways and staircases and all this very complex floor plan. And the thing about it is in the myth that Arthur Evans named this after, apparently according to the myth, King Minos lived in a maze-like palace, right? So that's why he's like, oh, the maze-like palace. Could be the Palace of Knossos. So it could be where Minos was from. So what if we'll call them the Minoans, right? So and that's where he actually got the whole thing from, right? And we noticed a lot of other things in a lot of the uncoverings of it as well. It also has some things that are culturally very different from other people we'll talk about. For example, we believe that Minoans also started pioneering the use of columns. This is like what you would consider a primitive column, not a Doric order one, because they're actually made out of wood. They're not actually made out of stone. But the thing about it is they may have actually started pioneering the use of columns. And then also they had art forms known as frescoes that we'll talk about a little bit later on as well. This right here could have been Minos's throne room, theoretically, or whoever was ruling over it at the time. And this could have been like an offering plate or a tax collection, or like literally could have been like a tax collector's room or something like that. But as you can see as well, with the floor plan, there were walls all over the place and staircases. It was a really, really architecturally large thing. The other thing that you need to understand as well is the Minoans were smart. Very, very, very brilliant level of people, because they even had indoor plumbing, right? King Minos, if he was real, could have gone to the bathroom in his palace and it just would have washed away, because they had running water that ran underneath the actual palace. So when you went to the bathroom, it just dropped into that running water and then just scooted on out of there, right? Genius concept, right? Genius concept. Indoor plumbing. It's going to be big. Now, the thing about it, though, as well, is that they found bull artifacts all over the place, which also could contribute to the name itself, because in, like, this other myth, there's this bull that's involved, right? Because the question we got to beg ourselves really, really quick is, like, do we think, like, here's the thing, how the heck are these people so prominent and all this different stuff, and then we didn't know about it for a really long time? How are we just now talking about the Minoans as of 1900? Because the thing about it is that we need to ask ourselves is there were all these other people that lived in Greece, the Athenians, the Spartans, all these other folks that actually popped up, Corinthians. Also, there were these people from Delphi and stuff like that. Did they know about them? Did they know? Did they know and we didn't know? How do we know that they knew that we know that they know about the Minoans? It kind of felt like this.
God. Oh my God, she knows about us. Joey, do they know that we know?
No.
Joey?
They know you know.
Oh, I knew it! They don't know that we know they know we know. And Joey, you can't say anything.
Couldn't if I wanted to.
Exactly. Like, how do we know? All right, well, we do think we know because literally the myths that were involved actually related to the bull artifacts that were discovered inside of the Palace of Knossos, right? Because there's this big, big grand story known as the national myth of Athens that we believe contributed to the growth of this entire understanding and this entire idea. But we will talk about that myth tomorrow in class. We'll talk about these bull artifacts. We'll go into all this different stuff. We'll review a bunch of stuff. I can't wait to tell you all that story because it's a lot of fun, right? There's there's people falling in love, and then there's a big hero, and he slays this monster, and all this other stuff, right? It's a lot of fun. I'll talk to y'all about that soon. Y'all have a great rest of your evening. I'll see y'all tomorrow.